I would like to welcome all of you to the lecture Wild Vienna by Friedrich Hauer and Andre Krammer. To give you a short introduction about Friedrich and Andre, they both are working on this topic since a while. They did a couple of publications and exhibitions about the Wild Vienna. I'm sure they will come to this topic in the coming lecture and explain very well what wild means in this context. But there is as you all know, a very strong and old tradition of social housing in Vienna. And nevertheless, the housing topic and the housing problem was very present in a couple of periods in the history of Vienna. And this wild Vienna is one of the results of this housing topic and housing problem in Vienna. So I would like to welcome you all again to this lecture of Friedrich and Andre. We will record it and keep it on the platform, on the teaching platform of the TU Wien, so it will not go public for everybody. But for the participants of these classes and these courses. Friedrich, I would like to give the word to you, and maybe you just introduce yourself in a few words for those colleagues that are not from Vienna. We have a couple of visitors and a couple of colleagues from Indonesia in this lecture, and for them especially, my warmest regards and welcome. Friedrich.
Thank you, Markus. We called our lecture Wild Vienna, looking back at the century of informal city development in Vienna, Austria. So we actually presume that all of you know what Vienna is and where it is. If it's not the case, then maybe interrupt. So basically, Vienna today is seemingly one of the most, let's say, formal and formalized urban environments that we might possibly think about. So everything is very regulated, and I brought to you this image of UNESCO World Heritage City Center just to visualize that. But the development of the city in the 20th century was really strongly influenced by informal settlements. Andre, could you turn off your mic?
Okay.
Thanks. So on a structural level, the traces of these formerly wild colonies or Bretteldörfer are still widely present in today's city fabric. We will take you back to the time 100 years ago. Basically to the end of World War I, 1918, when a large part of Vienna's 2 million inhabitants was struck by severe famine, by cold, disease, and desperate housing conditions. In this precarious situation, several thousands, some sources speak of more than 100,000 urbanites, were forced to self-empowerment. Illegal forest clearings, vegetable gardens, and squats with primitive houses and sheds were expanding in the Danube floodplain. They were expanding in the alpine foothills, in the fields and wastelands on the fringes of the city. Albeit reduced in scale, this wave of informal colonization reoccurred during the world economic crisis of the 30s, and it reoccurred another time in the unstable, precarious years after World War II, so basically in the years between 1945 and 1955. Brought to you two pictures of this early phase of informal settlements. One is the so-called war kitchen gardens, which were already taking place in the years of World War I. And another one is illegal settlements in the Danube floodplain. This is Burghafen, I think. which is an area that Andre will tell you something more about later on. So this is basically still existing as an urban fringe zone. As recent research has underlined, informal bottom-up settlements root in the war-related supply crisis before the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. With the official toleration of the increasingly panic-stricken Ancien regime, the city dwellers occupied fellow plots of land, and from 1914, the municipality of Vienna used large areas, including inner-city ones, for the supplementary provision of food to the allotment garden campaign, which is what we see on the left. War laws facilitated temporary disappropriation. Siegfried Mattel pointed out or commented that war kitchen gardens, allotment gardens, Schrebergärten, were mutating into benign cells of a new city vision born out of war, the vision of a city of settlers and gardeners. So this rapidly growing belt of wild settlements, as they were called, informal structures of land use and dwelling, was really increasing and growing wildly between 1918 and 1921. They were illegal in several respects. On the one hand, buildings were often built without the consent of the landowners. On the other hand, the erected buildings and established land uses hardly ever complied with building laws, and very rarely did they comply with the urban zoning plans in place, actually. In formalized allotment gardens and war kitchen gardens, people were dwelling illegally all year round. So I brought you some sources from the time we are talking about, basically, which is from an American journalist called Solita Solano, and she visited Vienna in 1922 at the acme of hyperinflation, so a few years after the war. And she wrote a quite interesting report for the National Geographic magazine, and she titled it "Vienna, a Capital Without a Nation," devoting a great deal of space to social misery in the city. She was particularly interested in the urban phenomenon of land occupation and gardening. So what we here see is pictures she featured in her article about illegal forest clearings for firewood and building materials. And I'll just quote a little on this topic of land occupation and gardening she was curious about. So she writes, on the edge of the city, the traveler will come upon curious little patches of gardens, each with a makeshift fence and a wooden building that looks like a child's playhouse. Women and children are weeding and carrying ground by having paths that step carefully between the plants. Blocks of scarlet poppies raised for their delicious seeds dot the hillside. The traveler is told that there is no end to these garden homes. They surround the city like a ragged girdle and are the result of the housing famine that has driven thousands of families to live here in huts, even in cold weather, where they add to the city's food supply by raising vegetables about the front door. She further comments that each cluster of gardens has a miniature delicatessen stand and an open-air beer hall, Schutzhaus as we call it today, where men, women, and children refresh themselves after a hard day's gardening. So here's some pictures she featured in the article. Makeshift lodgings she photographed in the outskirts of Vienna. Then you can also see these the gardening use in the bottom one. So this is actually the development we are tracing, and here you get an impression of how huge a development this was for the interbellum years. So this is actually only charting 1918 to 1938, and you have about like 10 to 11 square kilometers of unplanned detached housing or temporary homes or colonist settlements, and you have an even bigger share of allotment gardens, summer lodges, and less stable kinds of semi-informal structures. In fact, the Social Democratic City Administration, which had been in power since 1919, succeeded in largely capturing the spontaneous gardeners and settlers. So they were quite. This was quite anarchic in the beginning, and it was also a very colorful movement in the sense of ideology or political orientation. Most of it was social democratic, so decidedly left-wing, but not revolutionary, basically. So the municipality tried to capture this movement, and it took them a few years. They succeeded, but in several demonstrations with up to 100,000 participants gathering in front of the Vienna City Hall, the municipal administration was de facto forced onto a settler-friendly course. The settlers were supported with loans. A large part of the occupied land was subsequently formalized for settlement purposes. So often the city administration bought the land that had been squatted and tried to formalize, at least like giving lease contracts to the tenants. In 1921, then a so-called allotment and garden and settlement zone was created. The bottom-up land seizures of the years 1918 to 1921 was followed by a phase of cooperatively organized settlements with municipal financial aid. We'll just explain that a little later on, but now I flip through some of the phases of this development. So we have another one following the interbellum years. So this is actually charting the development until 1958, and if you add them up, there you have this enormous amount of plots and surfaces influenced by informal urbanization during the first decades of 20th century, and most of them still prevail. So our basic argument is that informal wild settlements, wild as they were called in Vienna, are an important aspect of the social history of Vienna, but also of its history of urban development. And they are vital. It's vital to understand them to get an idea of how the city works today. This is to provide some context to you. This is Vienna population in the current city limits. So you see something which is quite unusual for a European metropolis of that age. So you see that really the population peaked in the years of World War I, and then it declined. And it's only growing since like 20 years again. So this is very atypical if you look at other big places like Berlin or Paris or also Eastern European capitals like Budapest or Bucharest. You would have like steep growth phases in the 20s and 30s as well. Vienna was not like that. That's because of the collapse of the empire. So what were the drivers of informal urbanization in this first phase? Well, one of them sure was the collapse of the old regime and the weakening of state power in the aftermath of the defeat in World War I after 1918. Then there was quite important demographic shifts for several reasons I won't elaborate on here, but we have population declining for some 160,000, but we have the number of households was increasing a lot by 150,000 about. There was this important experience with self-sufficiency in World War I, the war kitchen garden. So people knew how to do it, or many people knew how to self-cater in that sense. Then there was this Lebensreform and green outdoor lifestyles that were very en vogue at that time. They are again now, I think. We have as another driver in the early 30s, like the world economic crisis and soaring unemployment. So people just had nowhere to go. So we have, you know, in the sources and also in the mapping, you know, that like from 1930 onwards, you have a big push towards these new informal settlements. Another important thing is in the crisis of the 20s and 30s, you have almost no private residential construction, which is also like a rate of return of zero. So no capitalist would basically invest in housing constructions. And for this first phase of like the most anarchic, let's say, there was surely the delayed start of the municipal social housing campaign, which is quite known, I think, among architects and urbanists, Red Vienna, which only started basically in 1925. And it was not able to meet the demand. So there were like 64,000 flats built in that period of time, but compare it to the number of households that increased by 150,000. So not even when it started and when it started to deliver, was it able to meet the demand. So we try to sketch that for you in this graphic scheme, which is basically a timeline and tries to convey to you these different, let's say, branches of informal or semi-informal development. So you have this phase of wild settlements in the first place after the war, and then out of this there is this famous settlers movement, which was a semi-formalized municipality-controlled kind of container for squatters. You have not few of these wild settlements continuing to exist, most notably some of the examples Andre will tell you about. Bretteldörfer, the most notorious one, would prevail until the 1960s. You have the topic of allotment gardens, which, as I told you, were also a kind of semi-informal thing, because they were rooted in squats, basically, often. And on the other hand, people were quite soon starting to dwell there all year round, which was not the idea and which was not the law. And you have like several waves of trying to formalize these things or trying to convince people not to stay there all year round or not to dwell there, actually. And you have a kind of emergency projects that would like from 1924 onwards develop into what is Red Vienna, the municipal multi-story housing program, which of course was a big thing. So, and here Andre will take over and will introduce to you some of the morphologies or the typology of different informal settlements in Vienna. I will mute my microphone now, and Andre will talk to that.
So thank you very much, Friedrich, for the introduction. So as Friedrich already mentioned, there were different types of wild settlements in Vienna. Due to the geographical location and the position in the territory of the city as a whole. So as I said, due to the geographical position and the location in the structural layout of the city, different types of wild settlements emerged. And we follow here a classification of the urban geographers Bobeck and Lichtenberger, who proposed a differentiation of colonists, clearing, agrarian, and allotment garden settlements. So, for instance, the colonist settlements were typical illegal squatter settlements that existed in the floodplain forests of the Danube. They were an outcome of self-help action of unemployed industrial workers. Similar to them were the clearing settlements that you could find mainly in the Wienerwald, the Viennese forest, that were also illegal and informal, of illegal and informal origin. The agrarian settlements were a little bit different in the aspect that they were a kind of overlapping of formal and informal origin. That means that some settlers had lease contracts, private lease contracts, but they had no building permission. Next slide, please. As you can see here on this aerial photograph at the end of the 30s, you can see a typical clearing settlement in the Vienna woods at the Salzberg. It's interesting to see when you go to the recent situation. Next slide, please. When you look at the current situation, you will find the same structural and morphological layout of the settlements. So they, in a structural and morphological way, they still exist today. Of course, they have been legalized and formalized. They have been integrated in the zoning plan of the city. So an infrastructural and legal upgrade has taken place. And it's interesting if you look at the zoning plan of today. Next slide, please. You can see, this is the zoning plan of today, that parts of it are now official housing areas and other parts are allotment garden areas with permission of all year dwelling and main residences. That's an interesting aspect of these allotment gardens we will talk about later. So, as so often in cities, the plot structure is the most enduring and permanent fundament of the city fabric. Next slide, please. Here you can see the airfield, the so-called airfield Aspern, in the so-called trans-Danubian area of the city, so the parts of the city across the Danube River. The airfield Aspern has been the main airport in Vienna up to the mid-50s. And you can see in the background the layout of typical agrarian settlements that still existed in the post-war period. As I told you before, they were a kind of a mixture of formal and informal structures, meaning that most settlers had lease contracts for their plots, but they had no building permission from the municipality. So very often this aspect of formality and informality overlaps in structures and settlements like this. Next one, please. Here you can see an aerial photograph at the beginning of the 30s. You see the Danube floodplains, the district of Kaisermühlen, and the area of the old Danube center right. You can see informal settlements and allotment gardens that accompany the banks of the river. It's interesting that these allotment gardens and wild settlements, as Friedrich stressed before, often shared aspects of informality. That means that people often lived in the allotment garden all year in simple sheds because of the housing shortage, the crisis, the hunger, and the lack of affordable housing in the central area of the city. Next one, please. An important aspect that Friedrich has mentioned before is the self-supply with food products. Many wild settlers grew vegetables and fruits on their plots. Some kept animals like chicken, goats, pigs, and so on. And here you can see a photograph of the 1950s, and still there were cattle grazing in the Danube inundation area. So this kind of supply with foods and agricultural aspect of these settlements continued on in the post-war period. Next one, please. Then next one, please. Okay. But if we talk about self-supply, it's important to stress that we are talking about a partial self-supply. And it's important to understand that most wild settlers were day laborers, unskilled or skilled workers who had jobs or day jobs in the city. So their self-supply was often a necessary supplement, but there was no real self-sufficiency. In this representation we are showing to you, you will see three different layouts of garden surface of plots in order to get an estimate how self-supply was possible in this situation. You see on the left a typical settlers movement plot with 400 square meters garden surface. So not a real option for sufficient self-supply. You see on the right side a settlement for the jobless, beginning of the 30s. Here you have a plot of 1,100 square meters. So this gets close to the possibility to self-supply. And the third one in the middle is a post-war 1947 typical municipal settlement which has only 100 square meters of garden area. So no chance of sufficient self-supply. So it was a necessary supplement, but it was no real self-sufficiency. Next one, please. So you now got an overview of these different types of informal wild settlements that were formed in the interwar period in Vienna. And as you have heard, they were situated at the fringe zone of the city of Vienna. That also meant that they were in conflict with regulations and zoning plans, such as the wood and grassland belt, the Wiener Wald and Wiesengürtel, that was a protected area encircling the city, was implemented by the city mayor Karl Lueger, the famous mayor, in 1905 in order, as was argued then, to safeguard the public health and the beautiful scenic of the periphery of the city. And so if you look at this map, I'm not sure if you can see it. This in red, you have these illegal wild settlements, and they very often overlap with these green zones that are part of this green belt. And this is a conflict. So that meant that the informal city often became an obstacle for urban planning strategies at a higher level. So there was a real conflict of planning and the reality of these informal and wild settlements. Next one, please. On this photograph, in the beginning of the 30s, you can see we want to make a statement with this photograph, and Friedrich was already speaking about the fact that these strands of development coexisted. So if you look at this photograph, you can see in the center of it a typical super block of red Vienna. Red Vienna, as Friedrich told you, was the a social municipal housing program that started in the mid-20s. On the right side, you can see fragments of Gründerzeit perimeter development. In the foreground, you see a series of allotment gardens, and in the background, you see wild, informal, typical wild and informal settlements. So what this image shows is that there was a coexistence and a simultaneity of residential structures in this period of city development in Vienna. Next one, please.
Bitte ein bisschen Geduld, ich habe da gerade
Okay.
reagiert gerade nicht.
Bei mir hängt es auch ein bisschen.
Ja, es dauert immer ungefähr 5 Sekunden, bis das neue Bild kommt.
Okay,
Aber
kein Problem.
ich bin jetzt da überhaupt. Jetzt geht's, glaube ich.
Yeah.
So.
So this diagram Friedrich has shown to you, it shows the parallel lines of development of the interwar period. To stress this once again, so it was not a simple linear phase of development that led from informal to formal production of space, but really it was a juxtaposition of strands of urban developments at different speeds. Next one, please. So what we want to show you now is some examples of single settlements, because it's interesting to see how different the developments took place, how diverse the biography of single settlements has been. You can see here on this aerial photograph 2 neighboring settlements in the north, Bruckhaufen and Bretteldorf. They are located in an area between the Danube and the Old Danube. That was an area that was afflicted with recurrent high waters. Bruckhaufen, the Bruckhaufen settlement, was legalized as early as 1929, so it became part of the zoning plan of the city, while the status of Bretteldorf remained precarious until the 1960s, so precarious until the post-war period. And the Bretteldorf settlement, as you can see, was threatened by a municipal dump site, a wasteland that was gradually enlarged and swallowed more and more parts of the Bretteldorf settlement. If we go to the next picture, the next slide, we can see in this I'm still waiting.
I am waiting too.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
Ich weiß auch nicht, warum der nicht reagiert.
So yeah, okay. So this is quite an impressive photograph. It shows the dump site that is expanding in the direction of the Bretteldorf settlement on the left, so threatening the houses and the sheds of the settlers. Next one, please. So on the one hand, very often there was a kind of a consolidation process. In relation, for instance, in relation to building materials, as you can see on this picture, since the first dwellings were simple sheds made out of wooden planks, the so-called Bretter in German, Bretter, hence the term Bretteldörfer. Later houses, as early as in the 20s, as you can see on these photographs, have been built in a massive solid construction way. In this example, we are showing to you in clay bricks. But this consolidation of the building of the houses and the fabric was not often not parallel to a consolidation of the status of the settlement. So the Bretteldorf settlement, you can see here an example of a house continued to be of a precarious illegal status. So it was not integrated in the zoning plan of the city. Next one. So this is the current situation. You can see, I hope you can see Bretteldorf, Burghaufen that still exists, sorry, Burghaufen. It still exists today. Today it is quite a popular and expensive housing area, connected to the underground. So really a very popular housing district. And in the area in the middle where Bretteldorf existed, now is Donaupark, the Danube Park, and the remains of the former informal settlement are buried below it. The last houses of Bretteldorf were demolished when in 1964 the WWII, the Viennese International Garden Show, took place, and a new park area that exists until today was established on the remains of the informal settlement and the former landfill site. So this example shows you the different fate and biography of that single settlements took until the recent until today. Next one, please. So if we look at the heritage of these settlements, and we look at Burghaufen settlement today, it's very interesting because you can still find traces of the former wild settlement, even if the settlement now has been upgraded, formalized, and legalized. In this picture, you can see the process of transformation that took place and takes place. Many old houses were demolished and new ones were built, often of a larger scale. But still today you have a coexistence of old settlers' houses and new houses, and you can see the simultaneity of different scales and construction dates that you can find today. So slowly, step by step, these old structures are disappearing now, but today you can still find traces of these former wild settlements. Next one. So it's important to stress that the settlements of the interwar period existed in the post-war period, and most of them exist on a structural and morphological level until today. Here you have an example at the western fringe of the city. You see the Wolfersberg settlement that was starting as a typical squatting settlement and allotment gardens in 1990 to 1920. Then in the middle you have Eden. It's a typical settlers movement settlement. So it was not illegal anymore because there was this. It was built in the period where the municipality supported the settlers in order to formalize their movement. And then you have Cordons Siedlungs, Cordon settlement. It was kind of a planned informal development that was built in the 1930s, so a bit later. It was integrated. There was a parceling plan in the mid of the 30s, and in the end of the 30s, it was integrated in the zoning, in the official zoning plan of the city of Vienna. Next one. If we look at the single settlements, it's interesting to stress out or to understand that the formalization process, the infrastructural upgrade, and the delayed integration into the official city planning and authority plans was a very complicated and difficult process sometimes. Because if you look, for instance, at Cordon Siedlung, you see the steepness of the slope and this was a kind of a challenge for the city to supply the normal infrastructural connections. So these settlements had to be connected to the sewage systems, to the canalization, to electricity, and so forth. And those who were responsible in the municipality were occupied by this formalization process even decades later. And this formalization process continued in the post-war era. So it took the municipality decades to formalize these structures. Next one. So we want to show you a short film that was made by the Viennese City Planning Department in the mid of the 50s. So now we are in the post-war period, in the period where they tried to integrate these former wild settlements into the official zoning plan and in the fabric of the city. You can start, Friedrich.
Okay, so this is an experiment. We don't know if it will work, if the replication in the streaming is enough for you to grapple, but I will start it and then you just feedback. Andre, you will also see if it works. Otherwise, we could just go and flip through stills. We will try. Doesn't start anyway, so. So it should be moving now. There is no sound.
Okay, I think it's a bit disturbed. You get some impression of the different types of houses that existed in the 50s. Now it's stopped again.
I might think of a workaround.
I could talk about the film anyway. What you see on the film.
Yeah. I think that's working.
It's working. Okay.
Yeah.
Here you see that provisional shed in a garden. So this kind of architectural bricolage that took place. Here you see an elderly woman coming home, and you see that she takes a path that is an unpaved street. So still the street infrastructure was not finished. Here you can see more. Yeah, you can see different types of houses. The unpaved streets. So you get an impression how basic the infrastructure was, a handmade stone wall in order to safeguard the slope of the hill. So made by the settlers themselves. And here a series of camera shots that show the provisional character of the settlement. Yeah.
So actually they were like documenting the mess.
Right.
That they had to fix. So that's what the reason why they were going there and filming this, because they were charged with formalize this.
Yeah, the car that you saw was in the 50s, so everyone got a car. And here you have a sign that warns of the steepness of the hill with a skull. Here again you have traces of wheels and water filled with water. So the municipality wanted to show how difficult the situation in this settlement still was in the period after the war in the 50s. Okay, next slide. Okay. Yeah, this shows a view to the Wolfersberg from the Cordon-Siedlung, and you can see, you get an impression of how these former wild settlements must have appeared in the interwar period. But as I told you before, on a structural and morphological level, this settlements still exist today, even if many houses have been rebuilt, are new houses. So there's a transformation process that went on, of course. Next one, please. What is important to mention and not to forget is that we concentrated and have a focus on the interwar period and then the post-war period, due to the fact that this was the two eras when most of the informal and wild settlements have been built in Vienna. But it's important to know that in between there was the Austrian fascist regime that started in 1933 with all its horrible social and political consequences. And from 1938 to 1945, there was the rule, as you might know, of the National Socialists. And of course, in 1939, the Second World War started. And to give you an impression of the disastrous outcomes of this era, we just give you one number. In this period, 87,000 apartments were destroyed in Vienna. And so 270,000 people were affected from the loss of their homes. So this, of course, was a very disastrous period. And it also meant that after the Second World War, there was again a crisis. And for many Viennese people, the need for self-help and to also continue the informal settlement at the fringe of the city. Next one, please. So this is the map that Friedrich showed you in his presentation. We show it here again to stress the reality of informal development that went on from 1938 to 1958. So there was a continuation. And you see on this map that the amount of informal structures on the fringe of the city that were built in this period was of a considerable extent. So this process went on. It's not just a phenomenon of the interwar period. Next one, please. So what took place after the Second World War was something that could be named a delayed legality. So the municipality of Vienna decided not to destroy these former wild or informal settlements, but they decided to integrate them into the zoning plan and into the legal system of the city. To give you, and this process of delayed legality and infrastructural upgrade and all that was connected with it took some decades until the 1980s to integrate this former informal settlements into the formalized city. So to give you some facts about this decades after the Second World War, the post-war period, after the 1960s, there were no more extensive wild settlements. So the crisis more or less was over. It was the post-war period when the economy was working again, and so there was no need for wild settlements. So this development stopped after the 1960s. After 1960. So as I told you, in 1963, for instance, the remainders of Bretteldörfer were razed to make way for the garden show, as I told you. And then the gradual legalization driven by the city government continued until the recent past, until the 1980s. And this is a fact that's not so well known in Vienna. And Friedrich and me, we have a kind of a research project that wants to focus on this post-war period. Maybe we can talk about that later. And it was the attempt was to integrate these previous informal structures into the zoning plan, and this attempt was not that easy, and sometimes there was the need to adjust the categories of the zoning plan to fit the built realities. That meant that sometimes the zoning plan adapted new categories like the garden. The Gartensiedlung, the garden settlement, it was a new category that was fit for this former informal structures. So there was a kind of an exchange between the formal and the informal reality of the city. And of course, as you can imagine, there were vast programs of infrastructural upgrade, because the municipality had to connect these former wild settlements to the infrastructure of the city. So if you think about streets, electricity, water supply, the sewage system, and public transport. So this was really an ongoing process that took the municipality for decades to finish. So I want to make a stop here in my presentation. And I think we see the next film now, if I hope it works.
Yes, I'll take over here from Andre. Thank you. I will try to show you another short film, which is basically about the second point you see here, the symbolic victory over informal settlements in the shape of Bretteldörfer, which had to make way for a posh 1960s garden show. And will show you, try to show you at least, a kind of advertisement show movie made by the municipality. So that was how it used to be, and that's the bright future. So the interesting thing is that Bretteldorf is just the ruins of Bretteldorf are beneath the park. So it's actually buried until this very day. It's buried there. So you have the ruins of the squat. Then you have a landfill with all the trash, and then you have the beautiful grass and flowers growing on top of it. So that's the way it works until this very day. So I think that's enough, because I guess you can't hear the sound of the movie, or do you? Andre, kannst du mir mal kurz sagen, ob man den Sound gehört hat?
Ich habe keinen Sound gehört.
Okay, yeah. So I will just show you a few more examples and compare them to present day states and put a few slides for maybe for the presentation also to put up some topics. So this is Biberhofen, one of the most remote and one of the most notorious squats, which was legalized in some steps. So this the Bretteldorf thing was just really a kind of symbolic victory. While everything else was more or less legalized, Bretteldorf went away, was buried, and there was much ado about it. So Biberhofen, in some respect, is the opposite of the story. So you see these former Danube arms and the squatted plots of land, and you see that when I go back and forth with the present state of it, you see that most of this very irregular structure has been conserved due to legalization procedures. Another quite interesting thing is the allotment gardens as a temporary fringe belt phenomenon. So we figured out that after World War I, but even more so after World War II, we had huge areas occupied by allotment gardens, which say, communicated with the regular formalized building structures because they were meant for workers to grow vegetables and spend their spare time there. So I will show you some urban fringe zone in the south of Vienna. This is Favoritenstraße. And you can see these small plots at the very margins. In 1938, there was already quite some quantity of allotment gardens. If you compare it to the post-World War II state, it's even a lot more of this. But much of this is we're getting only like temporary contracts for 1 or 2 years, and basically they were a kind of rather mobile container, let's say, or urban typology. So the municipality could move them around more or less when they were not needed so much anymore. And if you compare it to the present day state, you see that almost all of these, with the exception of a few small bits and pieces, very erratic, let's say, have gone away. So you could really, and we will, I think we will deal also with that in the research project because it's quite interesting. You can see these as a temporary use phenomenon if you have a scope of study that's on a few decades. And that's what they actually were meant to be also in the first place. And this is a document from the city planning department, which is an internal report about illegal settlements in the Wald- und Wiesengürtel, the woods and grasslands belt that Andre has talked about earlier. So you see, up until the 1980s, this is from 1982. If you look at these small red dots and areas, these were, despite all of legalization efforts, still in the 1980s, you had quite a few areas which were still in conflict with existing zoning laws, and especially the Wald- und Wiesengürtel law that was actually designed to preserve a recreational green area around the city. I think all of these that are like red, that were still contested zones, have been legalized ever since. And the last step in this process of legalizations and in let's say upgrading, also in terms of infrastructure, was the Allotment Garden Amendment of 1992, which explicitly states that it's meant for areas that were illegally settled and where built structures were built illegally before that. So they introduced a new zoning category, which enabled all year round dwelling. So this became the primary residence in allotment gardens, which is something quite unique to Vienna, I think, for European standards at least. They started in a kind of neoliberal esprit. They started the transition from tenure, from communal land that was leased to the right to private to sell it out to private ownerships. This led to an increasing privatization of public property, and we are already beyond the point of 2/3 of all former allotment gardens, which is more than 20,000 allotment gardens in the present day city that are in the zoning category of all year round dwelling that is a primary residence allotment garden. So what you see above is one of the most funniest, say, bricolage city things we came across, which is actually a remainder of a much vaster area of allotment gardens that was conserved by this, well, actually by several steps of legalization. So instead of a park, this very densely populated city district, instead of a park, it has, for the happy few, a nice little allotment garden area. As city planner and planning critic Bernhard Zeiss pointed out, on a structural level, in terms of urbanism, this is a fatal development, because areas of strategic importance that were once owned by the city were sold out to a large number of private owners. And as a result, a settlement pattern emerged that is not only problematic due to its low density, but it cannot be easily reversed, which was, as I said, like for the lucky few, this was also quite a gain in monetary terms. So if you want to buy allotment gardens in properties, and this is already, I think this is already a kind of, this is too low already, so you would have to spend quite some sums. So say a lot of people actually got rich by the squattings in the long run. And now I'll just project to you a few pictures which could maybe also be interesting for the question of discussion or for your own studies, which is the topic of delayed infrastructures, which started out from the very beginning. So you have on the left, like the water issue was there from the very beginning because there were gardens, and you had fire brigades stepping in from the First World War onwards in watering these gardens. You have, of course, the question of roads and paving. You have, and well, you had basically until the 1970s a huge problem in the floodplains with the flooding of informal homes, because, well, for several reasons actually, but also because they were built in risky zones, but they also were built on, they were like their siting in terms of leveling was not very clever in that sense. And in occasions like floodings, for example, you have a quite interesting mingling between formal and informal organization. So that's why we brought this picture of Bretteldörfer in 1926, when after an attempt of eviction, like 1 year after the really serious attempt to evict this settlement, the municipal government, after a severe flood, put to the disposal of the settlers their little railroad cars. They could borrow them from the trash dump to fix the dam, at the Danube. So the dam repair works were like a kind of interesting laboratory for informal and formal organizations already in the 1920s, and this of course reoccurred in the 1950s and 60s. We have a lot of planning literature that is dealing with these informal structures and is trying to, as you see here, think about upgrading these areas, developing also like social infrastructure. But you see, they were very concerned with traffic issues and so on and so forth. And we have already seen in the motion picture that Andre showed us earlier on, they were on the other side of the city at the alpine foothills. The problem of landside protection and slopes was a very permanent one and a very expensive one to fix. So they're complaining a lot about this. And this, maybe to stop with, this is not a story that is really over. So in Biberhafen, for example, one of the settlements I've just talked about, you have these upgradings going on to the very day. So they're just now from 2018 onwards, there are works going on there to connect them to the public sewage system, for example, and to regularize street passes and stuff like this. If you look at the left picture, you can also like guess what I meant by the problem of leveling of informal settlements in the Danube floodplain. So this is a hint to those of you who read German on the things we already published on the issue. We made a thematic issue of the RIF, Zeitschrift für Stadtforschung, 2 years ago, and there is a contribution with a special focus on the interbellum years in an exhibition catalog from last year, and we are really looking forward to scrutinize some more on the post-war period and in terms of urban planning and upgrade of informal settlements from the decades from the 50s to the 80s, 90s, or something like this. So thank you very much for your attention in the first place, and looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Fritz. That was a very, 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 very surprising lecture. A lot of things that I learned about Vienna. Thanks a lot. I knew, of course, a couple of these details, let's say like Bretteldörfer and so on, but the huge amount of illegal development in Vienna was really surprising for me as well. So I would like to open the discussion. If there are any questions, Friedrich and Andre will be happy to answer.
I have a question. Hello?
Sorry?
Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, sure. Because when you were talking about legalization, in 2020, who were the owners of the grounds on which the people have settled? And if those settlements have remained illegal until the very 1830s, did the owners of the ground protest, or did they get compensated, or did they get enteignet, or whatever you?
Would you want to answer, Andre, or should I?
You can answer.
Well, I would answer by stating that it's a quite complex issue, because as you've seen, there's a lot of plots, and there's a lot of different types, and also a few periods of squatting and settling illegally. What happened in the 1920s a lot is because terrain cost was very low, the municipality of Vienna succeeded in buying a lot of the land that was squatted before that. So so they were really buying a lot of land. It was called Bodenbevorratungspolitik, and informal settlement, as would be our argument, was one of the drivers of it. You would, of course, also have like Bruckhafen and Bretteldörfer, which were squats on the land of a monastery, of Klosterneuburg Stift monastery. And there you would have like also like Andre showed you that the Bretteldorf and Bruckhafen, even though they were like very close to each other and they had the same origins, had very different different biographies. And there, for example, you have the southern part. So Bretteldorf was already in the 1920s. I think the city of Vienna succeeded in buying the land from the Stift Klosterneuburg, from the monastery, and Burggrafen was remained Stift, I think, in parts until today, and some parts of it were sold out. Maybe Andre, you know a little more, but this is just like, you know, this is just one example of very many examples that might be very different, but this is not atypical. That's what's my point.
Yeah, so it's important to stress that the development of single settlements was really very different. And the biography took some turns in one situation and another turn in the other situation. So if you look at single settlements, you have to excavate the history of these settlements. And that made, for us, that's very interesting to see that the question where they are located in the territory and what history they went through is very important, you know, because it's connected to the territory of the city as a whole. And it matters if you are in the south or in the north or in the Venus woods or in the floodplains. That's also always a very different situation.
I might want to add one thing about the allotment gardens, because as you've seen, there's quite a lot of them still until today. And I think 2/3 or 3/4 of them are or were municipality owned. But you also have like a big, one of the biggest player apart from Stadt Wien, from the municipality, where it was the railway company. So you have a few players in that field as well. And as we have seen, with the issue of allotment gardens, there was this questionable decision to start to sell them out. So you would, at this point in time, I guess you would have about from what used to be the big pool of municipality-owned allotment gardens, you would have a sellout of half of them in a very irregular pattern. So that's what actually Reinhard Zeiss was also criticizing, because once you do that, all of these areas, they become useless in terms of strategic urban planning. A settlement patterns emerge that cannot be revised because of selling them out, and that's what happened to Burggrafen as well, I think. Mm-hmm. Because you don't have to sell everything.
And it's important. I think it's important to understand that when they made this amendment for the allotment garden law in 1992, Vienna was not growing that fast, because now Vienna is growing fast and is becoming a 2 million inhabitant city again. And now there's a big pressure on plots, on Holland, on building areas. So now this sold out allotment garden areas are kind of a problem for the planning authorities. And it's important to understand that the situation changed. So Vienna now is growing fast, and we're running out of plots. And so the density of the city is a big issue. And it's also important to understand that these wild and informal settlements have been quite a suburbanization process that was really a layer of the city that was an obstacle for the city development. So that's why these former structures are still very relevant today. It's not just an historical issue, but it's really something that's important for the situation we deal with now.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Of course, just continue with the questions. Either in the chat or directly via microphone.
Yes, thank you for the time. I think this was a great lecture from Friedrich and Andre. That's awesome. And then I want to ask some question. The one is what kind of garbage in the dump site? Since they like look like some like sand or land, and then how it treated. Since it's large and full of in the region, and it's become a beautiful park now and then. And then the second is what a unique heritage in Brughaven. It still exists, the wild settlement, and it's become heritage. Is it become the memory of the site or landmark or any purpose of that building? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andre, if you don't mind, I would like to answer the question on the trash dump, and you might want to answer on what Brughaven is today. Well, the trash dump thing is quite interesting because, well, actually everything was dumped there, but like in the 1930s or 40s, everything was much less than we have today. It was not that poisonous, but we have reports of all kinds of things. And actually, there were people living off the garbage, and that's also one of the roots of these settlements. And they were, of course, also taking used building material that was brought there to build their own dwellings. On the other hand, we have reports of organic waste that was coming from the markets or from hospitals. That sometimes there was a settlers kind of settlers pamphlets in the 1930s that were complaining a lot on the poisonous wastes coming from the hospitals, for example. On the other hand, we made interviews with people that remembered at least like the 50s when things were still quite irregular, and they were telling us that they used the trash dump also to feed their livestock, actually. So like the pigs were eating the trash that came from the markets and something like this. So I think your question is very interesting. It's hard to answer, and it would be I think it would be a great thing to study more in depth, but it's kind of hard also to study it, as you can guess. And yeah, one thing to add, the problem, of course, with the beautiful park is that, as I told you, underneath you have several meters, several layers of garbage from the 1920s to the 1960s, and this already, I think, a few years after the opening of the park, turned out to be a major environmental problem because of infiltration and stuff like this, and the gas coming out from the purification of organic matter. And it is a big issue until the very day. There have been infrastructural fixes, and it has to be surveilled until this very day. So it was not maybe the most clever thing to do, although it looks nice. So it's binding investments, and it will do so in the future. It's kind of legacy. So yeah, Andre, please take.
Yeah, so I want to say something to the current situation in the Brughaven settlement. I hope I understood the question in the right way. The heritage or the remains of the former village, the houses that still exist, that go back to this once informal status, they are disappearing now. So the transformation process is quite fast and quite brutal, I would say. So if you want to see the traces of this informal settlement still embedded in Brughaven, you have to go there now, because in 2 or 3 years they could all disappear. And there's no real acknowledgement in Vienna that this is an important heritage or an important trace of the history of city development. And Bruckhafen today, as I told you, is a quite fancy housing district for suburban villas, you could say. It's Bauklasse 1, so it means building class 1. So you can build quite large houses, and for instance, you have some diplomats living there because close by is the UNO city, the United Nations city of Vienna. And so some diplomats have houses there. So it's quite an upscale housing environment today. But still, now you still, if you go and wander through the streets, you can still find traces of these old houses of the 50s and some even 20s. Friedrich, I think, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.
Yes, sir. I want to ask, sir.
Go
Yes.
ahead, please. Yeah.
Very interesting, sir. I have a question regarding the illegal settlement. Have the refugees also caused this issue? Also about the refugees, does the refugees playing role in affecting the city planning and housing policy in Vienna? Thank you, sir.
Could you be more precise in the question in terms of time period? Are you referring to what refugees are you referring to, and what year basically? That would be
maybe currently or now, sir, in the present.
Maybe I can answer that. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The refugees nowadays that came to Vienna in the last years, they were more when they were integrated informally into the city. They were more integrated, or they found places to stay inside in the consolidated areas of the city. So in Altbau areas, and it's something that is not very well known. Yeah, so there should be research how this this refugee city that is now also a layer of the city in the and there is no real research and knowledge about this dwelling conditions that these refugees are dealing with now. It's a very interesting topic you are mentioning, but I think maybe Friedrich, you have other information. There is not so much known about it, but they are not living in informal settlements or something like that. That's a different situation today.
I agree with that totally, because yeah, obviously it's a different topic from what we were referring to you. But I think I don't know if there is no research whatsoever, but I think it's definitely very interesting. It would be very interesting to tackle the questions of 2015 influx of refugees and also the kind of legal or formal or semi-formal answers that were found for that, because that's quite interesting. Yeah, but I think you're right. There's no consistent research on that. I think it has changed a lot since 2017 or something.
I can remember that we made, Friedrich and me, we curated a congress at the Architectural Center in Vienna about the history of informal Vienna. And we wanted to discuss current strands of informality. And I remember that we discussed this topic you mentioned about refugees today in the city. But we decided not to have it as a public discussion, because it's quite difficult to speak about informality of the current situation, because it's a politically precarious theme to talk about in public. So that's a bit of difficulty you face with topics like that.
Yes, certainly is. And the other thing is that we also figured out that it's a very complex thing, and maybe it would be worthwhile to do a whole congress on that. So that were the two reasons why we decided to leave it out then, but we were really considering it. So I hope that
informality, as far as I understand it at the moment, is not constructed informality. It's not a development of settlements, and it's maybe informality in the use of vacancy or in the use of existing structures.
Yes.
Exactly.
And there were this kind of, like in 2015 and maybe 2016 as well, there were these kind of even promoted by official bodies. There were these kind of strange legal or not legal or semi-legal things they invented to house refugees in existing structures. So that's what also made it quite complicated, I think. But you're very right. We don't see them. Not, for example, in the special issue of the Reef we made, like this one, that's called Bidonville and Bretteldörfer. The cover image is Calais jungle, which is the very thing you did not have in Austria. But in France, for example, it was quite present, not only in Calais but also in Paris. So you have these kind of settlement structures that would really emerge as more or less independent or independently structured urban bodies.
Okay, sir. Understood, sir. Thank you so much for the information.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
So do we have any other question? A final one, maybe? We have maybe time for one last question. If there is not, then I would really express my thankfulness to you, Friedrich and Andre, for this lecture. Huh?
Ich hätte eine kurze Frage. Also I would have one more question. Have the shapes and the sizes of the legalized settlements and grounds, have they changed since then? Or are the boundaries of the properties still the same until today?
Magst du antworten, Andre, oder?
Du kannst gerne antworten. Ich kann auch was dazu sagen.
Yeah, the one thing I would like to add or comment on that is that we have, like, ever since there's this kind of real estate boom in Vienna. So let's say for the last 10 years, but intensifying over the last years, we have you have kind of developers flocking in, and what they do is actually they're buying parcels of land adjacent to each other, and so you really get in some areas you really get new kinds of let's say new kinds of modules or scale. Would you share this impression, Andre?
I would say that it depends on the situation. If you look at Bruckhafen, for instance, which is an official housing area, so building class 1, it's very interesting site for developers. So in Bruckhafen, there were some plots that were bought by developers where they made some projects that included several plots. So you have inside the former plot structure, you have kind of settlements, islands of settlements in the bigger settlements.
You see them here actually. I try to.
Yeah.
So that's more or less what you're talking about, Andre, right? So you see, for example,
exactly.
6 buildings that have their they even have a kind of small internal road. So this kind of building blocks, they are mutating recently, and what comes out of this is quite different from what used to be, let's say, the urban grain until like 15 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We could say that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes, very often, the plot structure is a very persistent structure of the city. But as you can see here in Bruckhaufen, even this plot structure is transformed, and so in some years it will be a totally different situation.
Would that answer some of your questions?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, so you see that there's actually a lot of research to be done.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it can also be very interesting for contemporary urban planning, also within this context of already formalized environments, because it's very important to understand how these things emerge and what's actually right now happening to them, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can point out a little bit what is the topic of your research program that you will start with the beginning of next year?
Andre?
Andre? Or
sorry,
Andre?
I had to answer the door. Sorry. Okay.
Okay. Well, I know I can do that as well. We're just waiting for your reply. Well, basically, we have.
Just a few sentences, just very
yes.
short.
Yes, basically, we will focus on the post-World War II period, so from 1945 to early 1990s, when, as we have pointed out, the last large-scale legalizations happened. And we basically will do 2 things. We will try to trace informal settlements and categorize them spatially. So we will make maps, and we will, on the other hand, look at what the urban planning authorities and what public discourse and advertisements were telling, and how they were dealing with the problem, or how they perceived the problem of informal settlements in post-war Vienna. So that's basically what we pretend to do.
And I think it's interesting not just to deal with this topic, not just in a historical sense, but also to see how this formal and the informal city, how they are intertwined, and how the negotiation between these systems of production of space work together. Because today we also have the topics of production of space bottom up, so the initiative of groups of people from below, and of course the need of a top-down urban planning. And it's very interesting to see how these 2 levels of production of space, in which relation these 2 levels can be thought of and can develop in the future. I would like to stress that this is also a topic that is in sense of how the future of the city will develop. It's not just a historical aspect, but it's important to understand that the city of Vienna was also a city of informal development that was not so well known until today.
And maybe we can even learn something from the way the administrations dealt with these vast and problematic structures over several over several decades, basically. So that's also something that's really, so we could see, okay, this worked and this didn't as they were planning, so this had these side effects. So this is also about, you could basically see Vienna as a case study where informal developments started earlier than in many places in the global south, and therefore it can provide a kind of look into the future also. Because you can look back at several decades of stabilization and mutation processes of this, and of planning, of course, urban planning, that had to deal with it.